Yeah, so I'm happy to be here. I'm calling in actually from my new office in Bremen, where I've started a new position. And you might see that this is not the most beautiful office and still quite chaotic with the shelf and this whiteboard and everything. But what you don't see and what you cannot know, and actually only now it occurred to me that probably this office is one of the most important offices for this book. Because you might not know, but you would know if you've read the acknowledgement, as I always do, actually, because I think that's one of the things. I mean, so Simone is not wrong oftentimes, but I think he's wrong with acknowledgement. At least I'm the one who's always reading acknowledgement first. So if you're reading the acknowledgement of the book, you will read that a good part of the book has been written, or at least one of the chapters, during a fellowship that Simone has been doing here in Bremen while I was not here yet. But when I started the professorship, I was allocated the rooms of the fellows as my new professor office. So probably this office is the office where Simone has done quite a bit of writing. And actually, when I started here, I still had some stuff in here. And one of the things was the lecture series of the time back then in 2019, when Simone was giving probably one of the first talks that was preparing the book. The title was Machines of Deception, Social Life After the Turing Test, October 2019. So quite an historic place. Doesn't look like it, but it's the fact. All right, so always look at the acknowledgements. All right. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I will start with kind of my own perspective on these questions of AI and social life, and then turn to Simone's, one of Simone's key arguments. So my background is in media and communication studies, but more from a social science perspective, I think a bit more than the others have argued. I always also look at the triangle between public communication, technology, and governance. So that's my angle on looking at these issues, but also always informed by STS perspectives. So I think there's quite a strong gap, not a gap, but a strong link. So let me start with maybe saying kind of my own perspective on these issues today is maybe that one thing that I think we are witnessing is, if you want to call it in the hype language, is kind of the making of 21st century AI. If you want to put it more accurately, what we are doing, or what many companies are doing, but also the public sectors and many startups, is kind of the building of the digital and at the same time material infrastructures of our time and of the decades to come. And I think we're living in quite an important kind of time window. And this is very similar, I think, to the situation, for example, of European cities in the late 19th century, when these cities, as we know them today, have more or less been constructed. For example, Berlin grew from a few 100,000 citizens to 3 million, as it is today, in only a few decades of that time. And the streets, the housing blocks, water and electricity infrastructure have been built in that time and have become remarkably resilient to changes. Only quite recently, I think, we have been able to question kind of such kind of car-centric designs of cities in Europe that are now no longer fully taken for granted, but they're still quite resilient and hard to change, as we're, for example, witnessing in Berlin currently, when it comes to realize the actual political consensus to prioritize public transport in bicycles. But it's still, the infrastructures are there, and it's not easy to, and also the spirit of this infrastructure is still there. So very resilient, hard to change. So I guess what I want to say is, we are currently, as societies, building kind of the digital infrastructures and the new material infrastructures that will last for decades. So that's maybe one of the stakes that we are talking about when we talk about these questions in a political sense. So that's one of my key interests in AI research. So what kind of infrastructures are we building here? What kind of politics do they bear? Who is driving and shaping this development? And what's the infrastructure and politics of the social world that AI is increasingly becoming an element of? Because I don't think we should always start from AI, but rather from the social relations. And I think that's exactly one of the key contributions of Simone's work, is not kind of starting from the technology, not starting from AI, but starting from relationships. So I think Simone's research and his great new book now look at this relationship of AI and the social, or to be more precise, AI as part of the social, maybe in contrast to my own work, primarily on the level of interactions. And the clever twist of Simone's argument in the book, I think, is to treat deception as a key, as also Catherine already said, as a key constitutive element of this relationship, rather than the exemption. And so with this twist, Simone, I think, importantly kind of lays the focus on the relation that is enacted in human-machine interactions and complicates this kind of long-standing kind of research field of human-computer interactions. He complicates this relationship in the best sense of the word, because he not only looks at the programmers optimizing the machine's behavior for a specific relationship and interactions with its users, and thus anticipating and integrating users' perceptions and routines, but he also highlights how we as users strongly anticipate and adapt to the affordances of the machine and its relationships, even though the allure of human-like interaction frames the situation. And I think it is exactly this mechanism that maybe is the most powerful and impactful force in today's AI systems, that this is not an external force that is changing simply our contexts, our future, or whatever, our cities, our interactions, but they are also changing us and our ordinary lives. Or as Simone, and I would like to read it, puts it much more eloquently on page 129. Therefore, as banal deception mechanisms disappear into the fabric of our everyday lives, it will become increasingly difficult to maintain clear distinctions between machines and humans at the social and cultural levels. Artificial intelligence influence on social habits and behaviors, moreover, will also involve situations where no machines are involved. There are growing concerns, for instance, that stereotypical constructions of gender, race, and class embedded in communicative AI stimulate people to reproduce the same prejudices in other contexts. Likewise, interactions between children and AI may shape their relationships not only with computers, but also with humans, redefining the dynamics of social contexts within and outside the family. And as the father of 4 boys, I can confirm that this is already happening. So I think maybe one of the interesting kind of consequences of this twist is exactly this aspect, that the world in which we have learned to interact with automatic systems and we have mutually adapted to each other is a different world, and we ourselves are becoming different humans. And that's for me kind of a strong kind of, so as I said, that's probably the most powerful impact I see kind of in the kind of increasingly integration of AI systems into our everyday lives. And it's also in my own work kind of one of the key aspects, kind of in that sense, kind of the deep shaping of AI of our world, or of automated systems. And if we get back to that example of the cities, the question might be kind of what kind of cities and what kind of worlds are we building with AI becoming a constitutive part? I think there's kind of one interesting case study in STS on the dishwasher as an example of how automation happens. That is not simply kind of normally, there's always these imaginaries of machines kind of enacting as humans, kind of the anthropomorphic robot doing the dishes and kind of doing the dishes as we do it. But the dishwasher clearly shows that a much more efficient way into translating this thing into an automatic procedure is a very different one. But it also demands from us very different elements. You need to kind of put the dishes into the dishwasher and get it back there. And these are the questions I think that are so interesting, kind of how is this mutual shaping happening? So if, for example, if you think about autonomous vehicles in cities, so how do cities need to be constructed in order to have really safe autonomous vehicles? And I myself, for example, wouldn't want to live in a dishwasher-like city. And going back to Simone's work, I think these are probably the questions. So kind of how do interactions kind of change over the course of the deeper integration of these systems into our everyday lives? And I look really forward into kind of forwarding this debates, and maybe in one time in the future, I will also contribute a book from this wonderful office as Simone has done, and I would be very happy if I were able to do that. So again, praise for the book. It's really a great contribution.